Hello, fellow co-creators. Welcome back to Seeds of Elegance. Today I have my friend David Wodtke here. He is a Gene Keys ambassador. We'll get into that in a little bit. A dream arc guide. He has many other nicknames that we might play with and talk about, as some of the guests on the show do. I myself have a nickname here, Creatrix Libby. And one of the biggest titles that he identifies with is a mentor in awakening. And with that, I would love to first say hello, David. Welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Hi, Libby. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And I would love to, this is the first episode where we're going to be getting a little bit more into an environmental consciousness, a deeper spiritual consciousness. And so I want to just walk my listeners into a little bit of the journey that led me to meeting you and some of the things that I just listed off to set the tone for today. So, Elegance Lab, again, it's a place that centers personal and systems transformation. And then Seeds of Elegance, this interview series that I do, it brings people to the table who have, I like to think of it, a seed of consciousness that they are here to plant in our collective consciousness. And some of them, that might be their life's work. Some of them, it might be an understanding, a belief system, a guidance system. Either way, we are having this conversation in a way that it seeks to inspire action, not just be listened to alone, but really received, contemplated, and offer opportunities for shifts in how we be, think, and do in the world. And when I started this series in December of 2023, I was primarily interviewing women who were in the sacred sexuality space because this is a new paradigm. Women who are working at the intersection of sexuality and spirituality. And I love fostering language, spaces where new language can surface so that things that feel scary, uncomfortable, or new can begin to interact with our system in a softer or gentler way. And part of my work within somatic work, connecting with the body and sexual healing, involved me beginning to relate to the earth and the environment in a new way. I already had this environmental awakening happening since I started traveling at the age of 22. I was a born New Yorker and I had very little environmental consciousness. And when I started traveling at the age of 22, I remember staying at a zero waste farm and how much my consciousness began to shift just being on that farm. I remember my hair tie broke, and I thought in normal society, I would just go to the store right now and buy a new hair tie. But here, I just tied it and reused it. And we were, being mindful of what trash was thrown away and how we were composting things. We were in Thailand, so we were literally using elephant poop as compost and nourishment for the soil. It was a lot of learning for my system. And I remember thinking, if I had been raised even 1 year, 1 week a year, going to a farm or doing anything environmental, the way that I would think right now would be different. And I also felt very convicted at that time that though I had studied a lot of different frameworks for social change, I'd never studied the environment in greater depth. And I felt curious why that was and longing to understand my relationship to the environment more. But I moved back to the US. I went through a suicide of my brother, and the journey I was on became much more about the emotional realms. Here, fast forward a couple of years into my journey with embodiment healing. Here I was getting all these new visions of Earth, this time not through traveling and exposure to Earth, but through guided meditation. The processes I was learning as a coach, they had to do with connecting to the body, but they also had to do with connecting to our visions. And this was a training about love, intimacy, and relationships. And yet, every vision I would have that invited me to think about deeper love, it would have to do with the ocean. It would have to do with the rainforest. It would have to do with different, just fire. Everything, it was always nature showing up. So much so that I was led into the gene key system, which is a archetypal system, a way of an ancient system based in the I Ching from Chinese philosophy that supports us to reconnect with all the layers of who we are that has a basis in the elements. And this system began to drop me into something much deeper within me that could hold some of the fear, anger, and deep, deep emotions that were starting to come up when I was connecting to the body and connecting to the way we are living on the earth as humans. So I'll pause there, but I'll just say I began to study this on my own for 6 months. And then after about 6 months of studying it on my own, I went to a meeting one day and David was at this meeting, and I voiced this concern that I have, this concern that I want to lead on the earth, but I don't know what to ground in. I don't feel like the models that we have are sufficient, and I find myself struggling to anchor. And so him and I had first we just had a call where we connected. And then he told me about a program he offered called Core Awareness, just for going deeper within. And it was several months later that I was in kind of some deeper emotional suffering that I reached out and I said, okay, there's some shifts happening in my life. I'd like to do core awareness, this program that you talked about, in alignment with these shifts so that I can allow this process to go even deeper. And then we began invoking some of the animals that process uses to help guide us into deeper presence. So there's a lot of different pieces, but I wanted to give that background. I don't even know if you know all that background, David, but I wanted to give that background into me reaching out to you in February and asking.
Yeah, yeah. I just love you putting it in that context, and that really sets the tone really beautifully. Yeah, for our conversation.
I would love for you to share a little bit about, we're going to be going deeper into this, but in the same way that I just shared, like I grew up in New York City, and so my connection to the environment happened in a way that was almost like someone who knows nothing getting exposed. Um, I would love to invite just if there's anything you'd like to share about like your own connection to nature and to animals, and then also spiritual awakening or what that means to you, and whether the spiritual emotional work was something connected with Earth or they were two separate journeys for you, how distinct those journeys felt.
Mm. Yeah, really interesting question. I mean, my background is, my connections to being in nature were mainly around going camping, you know, with my family, or um, you know, the place I grew up, my family I grew up in was more intellectual, academic. My dad's an academic, and so a lot of the energy is in the head there. But I always had this natural affinity for any animals, dogs and cats, plants, um, seem to be something I love, and I had a natural affinity for, um, Native American or indigenous types of, um, spirituality, I guess you could say. And so, I found myself, as I moved through life, I found myself, um, I've gone through a lot of various types of, um, kind of traumatic emotional moments, including, my own illness, or, uh, mental illness, and the mother and the significant, uh, kind of feminine figure in my life, and even the death of an infant son. And so for me, the feeling of that is uh, it's not something that it's easy to lean into, right? And at the same time, there's um, something behind it, something calling, I feel like, that is um, moving me closer to who I am or into an awareness of um, a place where the heart can expand. So I'm a little bit of a, I feel like a little bit of a sort of a black sheep in terms of my way of seeing the world, and I have a wild side. And yet part of me has gone through the motions, let's just say, of, doing certain things to feed my family, being, in types of careers that just didn't really feel like they suited me. For example, being a salesman or
Mm,
being a programmer, uh, and more recently, going into the classroom as a mainstream school teacher.
mm,
Um, but the place that I feel like it, the sort of the spirituality meets the practicality is, um, how can I bring, um, quote unquote awakening closer into the daily experience? If I feel an anxiety or a difficulty or a sorrow, how can I use that as fuel for um, the next step, the next initiative? And in this time that we live in with so much uncertainty, it's just even coming to a more and more of a crescendo, I would say, um, because I've always felt that what's very personal for me also has a universal aspect.
mm, mm,
So that may, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a little bit of kind of where I'm coming from.
mm. Thank you for sharing that. It really reminds me of, well, I want to share the feeling when I first started core awareness, which is just this 4 week offering that you have. It begins with presence. And there's a feeling I have when I'm around people like you. I'm going to put you all in a category, even though it's not a category, but people who I believe are in service to deeper awakening, which I would also love to define, but not just selling a thing, not just pushing a specific program or idea or educational system or anything that fits in a box. I know some of my collaborators, they push back on me when I critique selling and programs because they're like, these are sources of transformation, Libby. Stop critiquing them. Like they get to exist. And I'm like, they do, but also awakening doesn't fit in a box. Transformation doesn't fit in a box. And there's certain people who've been guides in my life who they're operating so from this principle of deeper awakening that does not fit into a box neatly, that something in my system actually gets afraid because I can feel the bigness and and there's the parts of me that just so want to compartmentalize and be like, I want to know, like I'll go here and I'll end up there and I'll be safe and it will be good. And the people who are as more deeply tapped into awakening as I understand it are people who are tapped into mystery, suffering, and humility and grace. And when I began core awareness, which began with the animal of the whale and the call to ask to be present to what is there, there was a deep discomfort in that whole week. And I actually remember messaging you and just you reflecting and mirroring back that trauma has a way of tuning us in and just feeling trusting in that moment to, even though I have been in trauma healing training, there's still a difference between saying, like, I'm actively working on this from a organized, structured way where I have a coach and we're going to go all into it and there's a purpose and a place for that. But approaching it from this more in the way the gene key system that connected us speaks to it, a way that's a little bit more feminine, I would say, a little bit more contemplative, a little bit more curious, a little bit more humbled self. And this reminder from you that was coming that uh, reminded me that the trauma is an invitation. And so, yeah, I wanted to ask what awakening means to you, and we'll start there, and then we can go into the setup of core awareness, an actual space you've made to help bring some awakening process into everyday life.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge question. I'll give a little bit more context that um, the words core awareness as a as a name for this guidance through the animal process or process guided by the animals, as I say it. Um, it came through to me during a period of deep healing, and so there's very much a sense for me around just being in the awareness of nature, and specifically, that can be the animals, could be sitting under a tree or connecting to, a stone or a mountain. But the the simplicity of that um, is something that can be felt almost in the bones, uh, and it brings me to a place of sort of feeling much more innocent and childlike,
Mm,
which is one of the essences, for example, that Jesus shared. You know, thou shalt not reveal thyself unto the prudent and the wise, but unto babes. And
mm,
so, in the context of your question around awakening,
mm,
I was drawn at a very relatively young age as a teenager to um, um, deep meditation practice and a spiritual teacher um, that I love, and that actually it was a traumatic event, one of them that I already mentioned, that sparked me to go deeper into those lessons. And so there's this sort of um, image around the word awakening that relates perhaps to things we refer to as enlightenment or satori, or something that seems to be far off um, as an aspiration, and yet it's also necessarily right here, right now, right?
mm,
And so to uh, to bring a little bit more of a spark of awakening into everyday life is to just begin to recognize a moment of awe, a moment of delight,
mm,
when I see the birds that come into my yard, or
mm,
um, when I, you know, even in the last week, there's been a couple of experiences that I've um, shared with some of my nature loving friends around, visitation from the sparrowhawk, and
mm,
um, the raccoon that was playing in the tree late at night when I went out in the backyard. And they bring up, so we can speak of levels of awakening, right? Or moments of awakening, or some sort of ultimate awakening. But underneath it is a feeling of um, release, almost
mm,
a relief, and a sort of a maybe an awakening to greater trust and
mm,
guidance and groundedness, rather than the what's so often coming up for many of us around feelings of overwhelm, or uncertainty or anxiety. There's a sense that um, everything is awake, you
mm,
know? There's a sense that, um, I can refer to it with words, and we can read about it from a lot of stories from Native people, that all of life is conscious, right? But to really begin to experience the awakeness of some being that we might not consider as intelligent or awake as a human is it's delightful to me.
Mhm.
Does that help?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, there's many pieces. Sometimes I feel the desire to refrain from commenting after someone. I always do because I'm a talker, but sometimes I'm like, oh, I just when you re-listen to these, I see sometimes, oh my gosh, I picked up on this piece and not this when that person spoke at that moment. And now when I re-listen, I hear something different. And so there's a lot of different pieces that you spoke on there. But I really love this, the one that I will use to continue bringing animals into this space is the layer, like this contemplation around layers of awakening and different types of consciousness that exists around us and observe, and also the inviting in moments of awe. Like even right now the tree outside my window is there's been really intense winds today and like the whole tree is shaking and there is a huge power in slowness and slowing down and beginning to receive more of what's happening around us that feels increasingly can feel hard to do in a world where everything is speeding up, where it also feels like everything is speeding up and going faster and more information coming at us and more news coming at us and more imagery of what's happening in our global connection through news feeds that sometimes tune us out to the connection that's right here in this environment that we are in. And something also that I want to invoke that I seek to uplift within Seeds of Elegance and Elegance Lab is to disrupt certain patterns that we have around what we perceive as spirituality and what we perceive as reality and what we perceive as how we think about religion and spirituality and how we think about our lives. And I allowed these conversations to come up naturally in what I'm speaking about with people. But when you also mention Jesus being this, speaking to the babe, and be like a child, I remember, I reference it when we started here about a couple of different more recent studies I've had through somatics. But right when my brother had passed back in 2019, I remember visiting some friends who were Christian. Christianity was not central in my life anymore. But I remember having this feeling being around them that they had an ability to talk about traumatic things in a way that did not centralize them. And I was curious about that. I thought I really missed this. I wasn't that spiritual at the time or engaged in any spiritual practices. And I thought I really miss being in an environment of people that can so bring up certain things from our past, but also not have them be right at the center. And it doesn't feel like they're being ignored, but also like they're not the center of the story. And I was like, what is that? Because I also felt like I was knowing at this time, I don't want to re-indoctrinate myself into the whole Christian narrative that I was raised with in all its structures, but I'm also craving this connection to deeper truth. And about a month or two after that was when I had this vision with where Jesus and the Buddha came to me, and I'd been studying Buddhism for a while. I was also studying yoga for a while, which I also know you have a background in. And so I was being humbled, I feel, into out of my mind, my thinking mind, and more into the energetics of different people on this in human history who have helped us consider deeper consciousness. But it would still, I've also always studied religious teachers more closely. And it was in the last year that studying from animals and nature itself, not just from me looking at how do I learn about nature, like from an intellectual way or save nature, but start to come at my own emotional healing as a way of getting to know nature through letting nature be in service of my healing. That things also like some new layers of awakening were happening for me. And one of those things was, I was thinking about this, like I never shared this with you, but I'm like, wow. And just sometimes you look back and you're like, oh wow, the way was like different seeds, different things were being planted and leading. I had this month or 3 weeks alone up North Michigan before I came to the meeting that you and I met at. That was a time I felt deeply lonely. And at that time, the kind of whispers that I was getting from my own inner voice was pay attention to the animals, pay attention to the animals, pay attention to the animals. You're not, and previous to that in my life, every time I would feel loneliness, I would go straight to humans. And by this time of October 24, I was at a place where it felt like I've tried humans. I've tried a lot of humans. And right now, it just does not feel like they are the ones to help me right now. And the beauty of being up north, there's a lot of deer. I would also hear coyotes. And so I just kept meditating on, okay, they do have, there's an intelligence and a knowledge base right here that's also wanting to support me. And as you say, as you've mentioned many times, this is an ancient intelligence. This is something that indigenous peoples around the world have been attuning to historically for millennial. So we're also bringing back an old consciousness to now, or remembering it, or making space for it. But yeah, those were just some pieces that stuck out to me in what you shared.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, to many native peoples, the animals are the teachers. They're creature teachers. And in the context of kind of the more if you go deep into the Hindu philosophy and the evolution of consciousness, it can be seen as consciousness can be seen as an element that pervades everything, right? Pervades the stones, and it can be seen to begin to awaken in the plants, and then move through the various forms of the animals, and then however magically or majestically to come into this human form is one of the greatest gifts of of potential awakening. And what is so it kind of comes back to that question of we have uh, this body, this nervous system that has a potential way beyond what most people are experiencing right now. And a few of the people have come in. You mentioned, Jesus and Buddha, and many others have come in to describe that in different ways. But so that's sort of, in a sense, that's a little bit of what led me to my, um, what I would call my playful contemplation of the animals. Is um, I had studied pretty strongly and deeply into a path laid out by one of the great masters, um, Yogananda, who also revered and reveres Jesus and Krishna and all of this, all the sages. And a lot, maybe because of my, being a, you know, child of an academic or, you know, middle class male, whatever the reason being, a lot of my energy had got into it in a more intellectual way. Like I read a lot and I collected a lot of books and not practiced as deeply as I would have liked. And yet what drew me to it was the promise of direct experience. So as I see it, we're in a point in time in terms of spirituality where um, we need to have the direct experience. We're past that time of a priest telling us what's good, right?
Mhm.
It has to be felt, it has to be experienced. And, it's amazing to me um, how that happens so naturally for people just being in nature or just even being in the park. Like what draws people to just go out and sit under a tree or um, be with, that sense of, like I say, delight when, people encounter, um, an otter in the river or, there's just, to me, that's always been a thrill. And so, when I came into my first sort of corporate job and I was a computer programmer and I was in a cubicle, that there was something about that that was very unnatural to me
Mm,
and very, very edgy. Like, so when I would have a break, I would go outside and walk. And that was, that was an interesting, really interesting time. And one day when I was walking, um, I walked up the hill. This was it. This was a time when I was in a place called Corvallis, Oregon. I walked up the hill, and there was, you know, relative open space and trees. It hadn't been too built up in that area at the time. And I came upon a bobcat who was staring me in the eyes in the path, holding a big snake in its mouth. And I got this sort of like visceral charge in my body, and the thought came to my mind, this should mean something to you. Like my mind was actually telling me if I was Native American, this would mean something to me. And then the other part of my mind, maybe the intuitive part, said, no, no, no. We create our own meanings. Just sit with this. And so that was sort of the beginning of my contemplative practice or deepening of the contemplative energy around the animals. And it wasn't long after that. As a kid, I had played with things like um, the medicine cards and the oracle deck and so on. And I began to think, well, I'm in this spiritual practice where there is a real call, and in my heart, there's a real call to balance the um, kind of yin, intuitive, divine feminine nature with the yang, the masculine. And so I began to just call out and choose an animal to speak for the Earth Mother and one to speak for the Sky Father, as I put it.
mm,
And I continue that practice to this day since that happened in 2004. And so that's a little bit about the background of sort of the playfulness around relating to the creature teachers. And playfulness is a big part of it. I mean, in the context of the dream arc um, uh, sphere, which is a whole, could be a whole nother conversation, but it has these sort of pillars of playfulness and discovery and generosity and trust that are very much aligned to the way that we can learn through the imaginative and the intuitive sides. And so I allowed myself when I was in this kind of contemplation of you know, the first animals that came up for me actually were the fox and the hawk.
mm,
So it's interesting in the context of today because we called in the hawk before we came on and pressed the record button.
mm,
And the fox is actually here in the feminine position again today. But I realized after a certain period of time that there was also a third energy being sort of born out of this. And so I call this the divine child or the golden child. And so that was the context that was set for me before I sort of received what we're calling core awareness. And that came in a number of ways, and we can go a little deeper into that. But it started out as a dream that I had of a whale, and the whale was diving. And so I've sort of had this um, cross vision of the whale diving into the ocean, going down to the way they feed, and then coming back up, and then coming back up to the surface and going in circles. So it created this cycle, this circle of diving and coming up for air. And that's become a real, um, I would say, a real supportive energy for me. And at some point after about a year or so, I realized it was something I could share with others. And it very much has um, energy and power around going into the emotional depths. Because when we speak about, um, you know, we shared some words about the first time I was sitting with what am I here for? Now, this is previous to the um, experience with the bobcat. And I was sitting in meditation at the time, and I got two words which were earth service. And I didn't get anything else. I got the sense that these were given to me, but like, here, what do you make of these? And and later on, I sort of got a subtitle, which is a new paradigm in environmental consciousness. And so you sort of introduce this idea of environmental consciousness, which has a certain context and energy around the words. But the newness of the paradigm to me is it's opening up to the environment of um, the whole, let's just say, the environment of
Yeah.
the emotional self, the inner self, and what when we look around on social media or feel the responses that other people are having to events, let's just say, or traumatic events in the world, it's a whole new context of environment and um, how to sit with it and how to use it as in a positive way for in a creative way for positive change, let's just say, or quote unquote what I call awakening the heart's natural love. So I'll take a pause there. Um,
Thank you for that redefinition of environmental consciousness and also for speaking into, there's a couple of things that I want to pull forth here. I want to pull them forth around a concept that's very important to me with Elegance Lab. It is, I believe the how is as important as the what, or this is also part of, for when we're talking about awakening many times, we're tapping into a way of being that taps us out of the current striving energy that's so constant, this constant hum of a next thing and out there, and what are we producing, and more into a spiral and a opening, a deepening. I like to think of the downward spiral that deepens us, the upward spiral that opens us. In psychology, sometimes the downward and upward spiral are used to contrast. Like if you're in a downward mental spiral, and we want to get you into an upward positive mind spiral. But if we look from a lens of consciousness or shadow work, then in my opinion, we are not just contrasting, let's say, low and high vibration alone or negative to positive, but actually dark and light, both as types of experience. And it's a nuance to hold, beginning to work with shadow and beginning to work with the darker shades of life. And when you're speaking, that's what I'm also reminded of, the ways in which, well, I got onto one I wanted to speak to. You're speaking into like making yourself available for information or downloads that are coming to you. Oh yeah, to go back to the how for a minute. And that's a different kind of how from how we're going to work on things in the world today. Right now we have a very like creative, I also use the word a lot in my life, creative consciousness. And I believe that creative consciousness right now is in a very masculine way where we think creative consciousness means I actualize, I create, I am the maker, as opposed to I'm a vessel, which this creative consciousness that already exists is coming through. And so, yes, I have this desire for the how to change, not just the what, not just the knowledge, not just the information, and not just the what of what we are creating, but the how. And as you speak into how core awareness, began speaking to you, how animals started speaking to you one at a time in the dream of the whale. I just want to invoke this because some of my viewers and people who work with me are newer, are visionaries who are just allowing themselves the experience of this style of creative consciousness or intuitive consciousness, not the one just that they are exerting, but the one that they are receiving. And one of the things that I'm many times beckoning to people about is allowing things to come in pieces because we have this yearning to know all at once, and allowing this animal to speak to you one at a time is powerful. And um, even when you mention the whale, first of all, when you just mentioned the whale dream of the whale coming out of the water and circling back in my mind created an image of yin and yang as well, to think of the polarization of air and water. And I want to bring in the theme of that working with animals has supported me in is you were talking about play. And um, this is something that I was introduced when I began exploring just a little bit of the dream arc, this animal, this way of looking at all these archetypes through the lens of animals. I never really thought that much about how animals underwater, animals on land, animals in the air each have their own qualities of consciousness and understanding and things to offer us. And also, when you mentioned how the whale came to you in a dream, it's interesting because literally the first week that I started the core awareness, that was actually the only one of the four animals that runs core awareness that came to me in a dream so far. But it was still very powerful because it was just a couple of days in. I literally read the reflections, I listened to meditation, and then I had a dream. And it wasn't whale coming out of the water, it was just in the water. But it was so peaceful, so blue, and this kind of electric blue, which my nails are a light blue, but this kind of electric blue is a color that's come to me a lot in my life as a kind of protective color. And I know I'm going in a couple different directions, but another thing that I want to point out that you're speaking to is environmental consciousness as something inclusive of emotion. And how right now, today, typically, again, the environmental consciousness we think of sometimes is more about the land itself and the animals itself. And with that, at least for me, and for many of us who are watching the current environmental needs that are speaking to us, there's a lot of emotionality around it. There's a lot of pain, sorrow when we look at species, especially, and how they are being impacted. And if we begin to take a larger account for what environment is and include ourselves as part of the environment and our emotional selves as part of this environment, which then, in my opinion, begins to invoke other kinds of intelligence and cosmic beings as also part of that environment, we actually tap into a larger space to hold what is happening. And I guess I just want to invoke that, bring it back to you, and thank you for the way in which your work is integrating these things or welcoming the space for them, because it, at least for me, it's creating a safety. Like this is also my own journey with learning how to connect to earth, but it's creating, it's tapping me into a larger field of support than I knew was a was available to me, and also giving me greater context for, I don't have the exact words for this, but it's like sometimes my emotions feel just like I can't handle them. They're so big, and I'm like, where am I supposed to ground this? What is big enough to hold this? And relating with the animals and relating with the way in which creature teachers bring us knowledge about how to connect with fear, connect with underworld, connect with overworld is creating a context for me to hold emotional experience in a way that I didn't think of prior.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to me too that you know it's easy to see some of the indigenous beliefs and teachings as primitive, right? This idea that, um, you know, maybe the medicine man or the shaman was called upon to, pray for rain or these kind of things. But it's also very deeply ingrained into the yogic teachings. The ancient teachings say that our way of thinking, behaving, and feeling in the world affect everything. And so it's also a place where, you know, perhaps painfully so at times we need, humans need to start taking responsibility for, what's going on around us. And that can be, hugely overwhelming, right? It could
Yeah.
be, it can be very shocking, especially in this day and age. And so I find it very fascinating that, the four animals of core awareness that sort of function in the cycle of the butterfly cycle, right? This is the structure that I received. And I won't go into the full story of that, but I find it really fascinating that they relate to um, very closely to the creatures that have come up through the gene keys transmission, specifically the dream arc, because the I mentioned the whale coming in the egg phase, but the spider then comes in the larva stage, and the spider is a galactic being. It's grandmother spider is an ancient symbol, and also specifically is there as an ally in the fear of overwhelm. And so there's a really interesting connection and potential there. And to me, it's the simplicity of it is be connected, right? Which is a huge potential to connect with the self, to connect with the source, to connect with um, the benevolent intelligence. Let's just give it a name, and to choose a new path, to choose a new way, which for me came through the deer and the swan. So to summarize the cocoon phase and the emergence of the butterfly, I had uh, I had all of these animals appear to me in dreams during that fall of 2006. And then also I was able to experience them in the physical world. And I was, kind of, oh, that's cool, having my fun time. And then in my practice of choosing two animals as balance animals, every new moon, that winter, there was a new moon that was on the winter solstice. And I chose on the one hand, for the mother, I chose the snake. And on the other side, for the father, I chose the butterfly. And it was at that point that I was like inspired to, out of the oracle deck, to choose four animals to represent the butterfly cycle. And so this is when sort of like the great mystery sort of poked fun at me and gave me the exact four animals that I'd been contemplating. The whale, spider, deer, and swan came in that sequence. And so when things come in threes, sometimes, it's like sort of like a wake up call. So you talk about waking up. I mean, that's definitely an ongoing process, but there are certain, let's just say, messages that call uh, for attention. And that's when I began to contemplate this process called core awareness. And
I want to add something too, but I'll let
yeah,
you.
go, no, go ahead. I'm good.
Okay, just as you were speaking that, it reminded me, this always happens when I'm in these conversations where I forget like what led me to connecting with people. I did share how we connected, but I forgot that I think either your name itself had the emojis in it or the first email you sent me had the emojis. I don't know. But you had the little emoji of the whale, the spider, the deer, and the swan. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know if I thought they were just random. And I was like, what's interesting about, and I love emojis because I'm very artsy. And I was like, what's interesting about those emojis is that the whale for me, all right, like under the sea stuff is what literally has supported me through, like when I said I kept having images come in my meditations, in my training, it was always under the sea first, which makes sense because I was going in the underworld more. But like I was like, okay, the whale for me, it's come more as a whale or a squid when I'm like connecting with the awe and wonder of bigness. I just sometimes call the benevolence bigness because I'm just like, I don't even know what you are. Um, and then with the spider, that one also did come to me in a dream, which was in October when I started getting the call to work with animals. And I started the Venus sequence, which is a part of the gene key system that has to do with the heart. And the spider was something I had a dream about. And I knew already, okay, if one of the things that are talked about sometimes in the system is if animals come in your dreams to look into them. And when I looked at the spider, I thought was bringing fear because I'm afraid of spiders. That's my human self. And when I looked it up, it was like this beautiful imagery that was actually very feminine and connected and the weaving of the web. And I was like, oh, okay, that's powerful. And then the deer just kept emerging in all these places for me. And the deer from just like this book that I had read from a woman who had an animal book said that the deer had to do a lot with innocence. And I also have in my profile within the Gene Keys system, what we get as profiles. We all have all of them, but some of us have we have like 11 that show up in our life, and one that shows up right in the core of my life is the archetype that has to do with innocence. And so I thought, okay, that's just an interesting, like those three have already been showing up. And then the one I said, and then I wrote to you, I shared that and I said, but the one that I don't know that it doesn't have significance is whatever the fourth animal was. I couldn't even tell what it was. And you're like, it's the swan. And I think it's so beautiful. It's just so powerful when we think about the timing that we come into each other's lives as humans, because it's like here, universe was having those different creatures speak to me with the swan not being one. And really, that's what I was needing in my life. The swan in your meditation on the swan involves surrender and grace and release of control. And that's been a practice that I'm learning more about. So I just wanted to add, thank you for mentioning the date 2006 as well, because in some ways, date, I feel like time doesn't exist or the dates don't matter, but in other ways, it's so powerful sometimes when it's why I have so much peace when I have these conversations with Seeds of Elegance. I know we're talking about things that are timeless. And it's like 2006, I was living in New York City as a kid. Um, I would have loved to be getting exposed to animal wisdom at that time and being pointed to look in that direction. Instead, I was writing endless notes, trying to solve my way out of my mental issues. And um, so just want to speak into how it's so living, the intelligence of all these creatures. They outlive, they're older than us, most of these creatures, and they're carrying wisdom, and then we're discovering it, and then you piece it, and also I just want to speak to your piecing together of these animal representations of the butterfly cycle. I've been talking about spiritual evolution for a while, but the butterfly cycle just made it feel so tangible, like the way you spoke the process of egg, larva,
Yeah, yeah,
cocoon to the birthing stage. It gave me, even right now, as I've been teaching in different places or speaking, I just can call upon it very easily and re-bring it back and just remind myself that this process is at play all the time.
yeah, yeah. I could give it just a little bit of context too, because it was shortly after that that I came into the Gene Keys paradigm, Gene Keys transmission, which I won't. There's so much to be gathered and studied and enjoyed in the Gene Keys, but the idea of moving through this pathway of love that you're referring to as the Venus, it lands in a place, and we're in a contemplation actually in this moment, in a group contemplation of what's called the core or the core wound. And I didn't have any concept of that when I received um, the words core awareness. I was keyed into the core heart, which is very much where the wounding occurs, or the sacred wound, as it's referred to in the keys. And so I really feel that the this process for me and working with the animals is a very practical and useful way to move into that um, our sort of like the primal wounding pattern that um, allows us to be incarnate, allows us to be human, allows us to be in form, and also is a place as it gradually is opened and received that our true vocation comes from. Maybe I'll just finish by saying, um, in the context of this, moving deeper and deeper into this core um, wound, the sacred wound that is a place where the emergence of true vocation and true purpose or spiritual purpose comes from. Um, I really feel like core awareness, the process is very closely aligned to my, pattern and my place in the, the human family at this time. And if I go back, you know, all the way to the year 2000, the context of this period, really from 2000 to 2007, was very deep healing because I had a major surgery for pancreatic cancer in 2001, and in the context of a lot of healing, including the surgeons and the wonderful people who took care of me. And when they got to do the surgery, there was no cancer. So there was a miraculous aspect and a practical aspect at the same time. But I mention this because there's also a beautiful aspect in my um, way and in my presentation of core awareness, which refers to a mythical creature called Chiron, who is half horse and half human. So to me, there's like an invitation, a healing invitation from connecting with um, the primal wounding pattern or the animal part of me, and raising it up into greater awareness as a way of um, creating an offering of deep love and service to the world.
Wow, layers in there. Mhm. For today's conversation, we're gonna begin winding it down. But I wonder, as somebody who's been walking this path, allowing yourself to be led and taught through nature itself, through animals, what do you feel? There's a part of me that's like, I've at least found the more that I go into nature's realm, the more I'm like, there's less I want to say. Just go yourself. What you were talking about earlier, we need our own first person experiences. But there is so much power when those of us who've walked a path first or more deeply or had more focus, concentration, attention on that we can get nuggets, we can get guidance to just keep doing that personal path. And so I just wonder what guidance you might offer for those of us who are newer from learning in this way and learning from animals and learning from nature. And maybe not that you need to put the words to it, but if there's any language from environmental consciousness as you've engaged with it, that might be supportive for those of us that are still in an older paradigm of environment out there, me out here, or emotions over there, and logic being over here. uh,
Yeah.
some guidance around this unitive work that you were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I just to be clear, I'm very much, you know, on the edge of this practice. Like the reason that am so, um, that I so love core awareness is that it's just part of me. I can't escape it. And that's because
Hmm.
um, life calls me out. You know, the mind, the overwhelm, the overthinking is a almost pandemic proportions in the world, and it can become even more difficult in times of stress, in times of um, various types of difficulties. And you know the beauty that I would offer, the simplicity that I would offer is actually given in in Gene Keys. It's referred to as the art of contemplation, which is um, yes, it's great to have a spiritual practice of your choice, and it's wonderful to have um, time in nature and deep meditation, and you know create the list that works for you. But in the everyday, the power of the pause and the reminder to just take a moment to breathe, is the simplicity of moving from a point um, of loss or um, emotional overwhelm or anger or sorrow, to make a pivot back into the essential, and to um, just invite in a moment of peace, and to realize that that's something that is uh, available within, and it's manufactured within each of us. The all of the great teachers have referred to that. Um, and anytime we can do that is a huge service to the earth. I mean, it's really sounds almost too simple and perhaps even too trite, but it's really the place where um, change begins towards peace and harmony on the outside, in my humble opinion and sense of things.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking that. Maybe we can take a couple breaths together here, just
Mm.
honoring that sacred pause.
Mm.
I'd also love to get to read just a portion of the Swan, if you're open to that.
That would be wonderful. Yeah. Would you like to read it?
Yeah, I have it pulled up. Well, there's so many. There's actually, now that I have it pulled up, I'm like, there's so many different pieces of it. I'll read from part of the message of the swan that you've offer. So this is an example as well in core awareness. What you're getting is an invitation from each of these animals that we listed, invitation into meditation on some of the qualities they bring, and an actual recording, and just some written reflection. So I am Swan, the white-winged bird who glides easily and effortlessly in air or water. I am the questionless question, the gift of grace who sees what cannot be seen and knows what cannot be known. I come in the fourth and last phase. When the path is clear, I will come. And yet, I am always everywhere present in you, in all, patiently waiting for space between breaths to reflect your blessedness in the crystal pool of your innermost sanctuary. My love is given freely and never as any consequence. My seed was planted in your heart in the beginning and remains there always. You may cultivate the soil of your devotion, but the seed sprouts of its own accord by the breath of grace. The egg will hatch when it's broken. Often you have felt my touch as the pain of your shattered shell, yet this pain that you call illness and chaos is not meant to harm you, but to awaken you to your higher vision. How can you fly from within your shell? It has been given to wail to watch the beginning and end of all things. Know when you breathe that it is I who breathe you. I and thou are one. And though I may break you, empty you, that emptiness is like the space in a reed flute where the breath of grace flows easily. You, like a flute, have a unique song that you sing. It is the song of creation, known to whale, spider, deer, and all creatures when they watch the breath and listen to the silence. This is the butterfly blessing. You have called me God, Guru, Goddess, Mother, Father, Christ, Krishna, Allah, Kokopele, and many other names. I am all and none of these. That love is mine, whose love is given freely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you'd like to offer as we open at the close, close at the open?
Um, I feel very complete. I'll just share that it's been a long journey to bring core awareness into a structured form as an offering. And I have worked on as a pilot project that you've experienced over the last almost a year and a half. And so I look forward to, and I appreciate all those who have participated in it and given me feedback because it's just given me so much inspiration. I just really, um, want to share that inspiration with um, many, many others.
Mm. Beautiful. And I'll drop some information below this video so people who want to get in touch with David can test this out. You get access to this guidance and also a one-on-one session with him, which for me also is very deep and guiding. And even in this, well, in the course, there was a couple moments where I would just send a line from one of the animals to a friend because it felt so relevant to what they were going through. And I remember during the deer, one friend saying, that line summarizes what my life has been. And I was like, well, it's written by a friend who allowed kind of channeled or, welcomed this message through meditation on this animal. And she was like, wow. And part of that swan piece I had sent to another teacher of mine. And she was like, thank you. So it's just powerful. I wanted to also make the space for this conversation today to as an entry point for people who might want to explore this. Um, and I want to name that there's such a variety of people who, and seekers and travelers on this earth who can be served through this deeper contemplation. So if it calls you, definitely inquire with myself or David, and we will get you an access to some support and structure on this meditative contemplative journey.
Yeah, and thanks again for inviting me and for sharing the words. It's interesting because over the years, early on, people started to know me as the animal guy, and some people, referred to it as channeling, and I never thought of it like that. And and some people would even say, well, if that's not channeling, I don't know what is. Uh, and and yet and yet for me, it was like when I had that first experience with Bobcat and the snake, I actually had a fairly depth conversation over the course of a year or so with a Cherokee medicine woman. And she said, hey, look, it's simple. If the animal comes to you, just close your eyes, imagine it, and begin to talk to it.
Mm.
And so I would just throw that out there that this is nothing special for me. This is part of the offering of connecting with the energy of nature and animals, that um, we have that already within us as an intuitive and an imaginative ability.
Mhm.
And to ask is the first step. Then to open and deep listening is the sometimes challenging aspect for those of us who work within the realm of a busy mind.
Mm. Well, thank you. And thank you, listeners. And as I sometimes speak in other episodes, what questions come up, what did things you'd like to learn more about, you're welcome to send me. We plan usually when I do these episodes, even though I haven't done a part two yet, I have opening in my world for part twos and also for living experiences, be it meditative journeys or other things that might also emerge through these situations and conversations. So thank you for your presence today.